Look, nobody saw this coming. Humanity was merrily existing in our corner of the galaxy, convinced we were alone, when the Krell Dominion showed up. And I mean, showed up like that one relative at Thanksgiving, who somehow always finds your house, even though you have moved 4 times. Turns out the universe is full of aggressive insectoid species, with exoskeletons that make them look like they were designed in a biomechanical fever dream. The Krell had been the dominant force for about 300 years. They conquered more, and they really perfected the whole conquering thing. But here's the kicker. They had this weird honor code about strength. Before they steamrolled your civilization, they gave you a shot in something called the Trials. One-on-one combat in their ancient arena. Win, and you get to be an equal trading partner. Lose, and congratulations, you're now a resource. Earth's military leadership panicked. The United Nations went into overdrive. They needed a champion. Not just any champion, but someone who could represent humanity's strength and ingenuity. Someone tough, someone smart, someone inspirational. So naturally, they picked Marcus Vance. Marcus wasn't a decorated general or a specially trained government soldier. Marcus was a former construction foreman from New Jersey who had gotten incredibly jacked after his divorce. He spent most of his time arguing with the gym guy about proper form and texting his ex-wife sarcastic comments about her new boyfriend. Somehow, this man ended up on Earth's Defense Council, getting briefed by Commander Riley, a woman so military that her handshake probably violated the Geneva Convention. The briefing room was all sterile whites and concerned faces. Riley laid it out like she was describing a nuclear launch procedure. The Krell champion was a creature called Vrax. Vrax had won 17 consecutive trials. Vrax had personally destroyed 3 minor civilizations that challenged him. Vrax was big. Vrax was strong. Vrax had never lost. Marcus listened to all this, sipped his coffee, and then asked if he could negotiate a training montage. Riley did not appreciate the humor, but Marcus had already accepted the mission. Why? Because Marcus understood something fundamental about being human that nobody else in that room got. Sometimes the only rational response to an irrational situation is to lean into the absurdity and see what happens. The transport ship left Earth orbit 3 days later, carrying Marcus, Commander Riley, a small diplomatic team, and approximately 8 tons of coffee because Marcus insisted. The journey to the Krell homeworld took 2 weeks through faster-than-light space, which gave Marcus plenty of time to review Vrax's combat records, and absolutely none of that stuck, because he was mostly watching action movies and making notes on cool intimidation tactics. Commander Riley watched him do this and considered requesting a transfer. By the time they landed, the entire galaxy knew the joke. Earth had sent a muscular sarcasm machine to fight a literal monster. The betting odds against humanity were approximately 4,000 to 1. In the casino stations around the Krell system, humans were basically considered free money. The arena was obscene. Picture the Colosseum, but if it was built by aliens who had never heard of subtlety and had access to planetary engineering equipment. The structure rose from the ground like a titanium fist punching through reality. It was carved from a solid rock formation, expanded with force fields and reinforced with materials that humans didn't have names for. The stands could seat approximately 6 million spectators. On the day Marcus arrived, they were full. Krell, Venorians, Quilaxians, and about 40 other species had come to watch humanity get destroyed. There was merchandise. Actual merchandise. Someone was selling plushy versions of Vrax next to little foam weapons shaped like human arms. It was humiliating. Marcus walked into the arena's preparation chamber, and his first reaction was to ask if the bathroom was titanium reinforced, because he was pretty sure he was about to need it. Commander Riley didn't laugh. The Krell ambassador, a magnificent bastard named Scritch, greeted them with the kind of smile that looks great on a negotiating table, but absolutely terrifying on a creature with 12-degree mandible rotation. Scritch was tall, even for a Krell, with an exoskeleton that shifted between dark blues and purples. He spoke in Common Galactic, which sounded like someone had fed a violin to a wind machine. Scritch explained the trials with the tone of someone describing rules to a toddler. There would be 3 phases. strength challenges, endurance tests, and a final trial that had eliminated every single previous challenger who wasn't from a species with 3 redundant neural systems. Marcus nodded along, asking stupid questions about whether he could use the bathroom between rounds and if the medical bay had good coffee. Scritch's translator struggled with the sarcasm. Meanwhile, Vrax was already in the arena proper, casually lifting boulders the size of office buildings and throwing them like baseballs. The crowd was roaring. Sports fans across the galaxy were live-streaming it. This was basically the Super Bowl if the Super Bowl could actually destroy humanity. Commander Riley pulled Marcus aside. She had that look that military people get when they're about to say something deeply honest. She told him the same thing his ex-wife had probably told him the night they split. The smart people are counting on you to be smarter than you are pretending to be. Marcus assured her he was absolutely planning to wing it and see what happened. He then walked out onto the arena floor, made eye contact with Vrax, and made a joke about the Krell champion's posture looking like it hurt. The crowd went silent. Vrax tilted his head, a gesture that probably meant he was considering which part of Marcus to destroy first. Commander Riley considered requesting that transfer again. The preparation chamber smelled like ozone, and something vaguely like burned insect, which was not comforting. Marcus was fitted with a standard competition suit that was rated for about 500 Gs of force distribution. The suit was probably designed for something 10 feet tall and made entirely of muscle. On Marcus, it looked like he was wearing an expensive sleeping bag that promised to keep him alive for approximately 3 seconds longer than he'd probably need. The medical team ran scans. They checked his bone density, his muscle composition, his organ function. They seemed genuinely concerned that he was, in fact, an actual carbon-based life form and not some kind of trick. One doctor asked if Earth had gravity 6 times higher than the standard. Marcus said no, he just had really good genetics and a solid gym routine. The doctor looked devastated that the explanation was so mundane. By the time Marcus made it to the arena entrance, the sun was setting over the stadium. Dramatic lighting, naturally. The Krell probably scheduled these things specifically for optimal theatrical effect. He could hear the crowd through the tunnel. Millions of voices, betting slips being placed, merchandise flying off the shelves. Somewhere in that crowd, someone had bet their entire life savings on Vrax to win within the first 5 minutes. They were probably having a very good day about it. Before the official trials began, both champions had to perform what the Krell called a display of capability. This was basically the opening act before the main event, a chance to show the crowd what you were working with. It was also completely unnecessary and entirely theatrical, which meant the Krell loved it. Vrax went first, and he went hard. He walked to the center of the arena and proceeded to do something that would have made every strength athlete on Earth weep into their protein shakes. He grabbed a mountainside, an actual mountain that the Krell had placed in the arena's center for exactly this purpose, and he lifted it. Not just lifted it with one appendage while maintaining perfect balance, then he tossed it like a shot put. The mountain flew across the arena and crashed into a reinforced wall that absorbed the impact without flinching. The crowd erupted. The Krell section was chanting something that probably translated to "destroy the mammal." It was a humbling display of raw power. Then Marcus's turn came. He walked to the center with the kind of confidence that only comes from either complete certainty or complete delusion. He did some stretches that would have horrified any legitimate fitness trainer. He touched his toes, reached for the sky, did a little spin like he was about to do an aerobics class. Then he did something completely unexpected. He challenged Vrax to arm wrestling. The crowd didn't know how to respond. Vrax tilted his head again, a gesture that was becoming Marcus's favorite indicator of Krell confusion. Arm wrestling. That was what Marcus wanted to do. The strongest creature in this quadrant of space versus a human. In arm wrestling, the simplicity of it was either genius or suicidal. Nobody could tell which. They sat at a reinforced table that had been constructed specifically for this moment. Marcus versus Vrax. When the Krell referee gave the signal, something unexpected happened. Marcus didn't go full strength immediately. Instead, he felt out Vrax's leverage, his muscle orientation. The way the alien was distributing power through his exoskeleton. This was construction foreman knowledge. You don't build buildings by pushing straight forward. You understand load distribution. You understand structural integrity. And while Vrax won the arm wrestling match in about 6 seconds, crushing Marcus's arm backward until Marcus was pretty sure his shoulder had been introduced to new dimensions, Marcus had learned something crucial. He'd felt the slight vibrations in the table, the way the arena itself resonated with Vrax's power, the subtle feedback of how this entire massive structure responded to force. Marcus stood up, shook his arm like it wasn't currently on fire, and told Vrax that he seemed pretty strong for a bug. Vrax made a sound that the translators rendered as, "Insignificant mammal will perish." Marcus said that was probably true, but asked if there were any special rules about what constituted strength. Could you be strong without actually moving anything? Could strength be understanding? Could it be knowledge? Could it be about how you interpreted a problem rather than how hard you could push? The Krell judges conferred. Scritch looked mildly annoyed. The trials had rules, after all. Physical trials tested physical strength. It was simple. It was clean. It was, Marcus was realizing, incredibly literal. The Krell were strong in most ways. They were not particularly creative in their interpretation of rules. They'd conquered most of known space through pure military superiority and adherence to protocol. The idea that someone might exploit the loopholes in their own system probably hadn't occurred to them. Marcus was beginning to understand that he didn't need to be stronger than Vrax. He needed to be smarter about the game they were playing. He looked up at the arena structure, studying its architecture. Massive columns supporting the stands. Magnetic suspension fields visible if you knew what to look for. Force distribution networks running throughout the structure. The arena wasn't just a place where trials happened. It was a system. A carefully engineered system designed to handle the kinds of forces that beings like Vrax could generate. Which meant that system had parameters. It had weight limits. It had stress points. It had weaknesses. And Marcus was beginning to suspect that if you understood those weaknesses, you might be able to do something nobody had ever thought to do before. The first official trial phase commenced with Marcus deliberately performing like he'd never lifted anything heavier than a beer can. He attempted to lift a structure that was supposedly reinforced to hold about 500 tons. He struggled. He made pained noises. He sat down between attempts and looked exhausted. The crowd actually felt bad for him. People were making jokes about it. There was a betting pool about how quickly he'd lose. Vrax watched with something that might have been contempt. When Vrax's turn came, he didn't even warm up. He grabbed the structure, lifted it with one massive appendage, held it there for several seconds while the crowd went wild, and then placed it back down like he was setting a child on the ground. Perfect form, impossible strength. Vrax was winning. But Marcus wasn't actually being weak. He was studying. Every time he touched something in the arena, he felt the vibrations. He felt how the ground responded. He was noticing that the arena wasn't solid. It was constructed. It had support systems. It had points where force could be distributed differently. When he sat down to recover, he was asking seemingly stupid questions of the judges. What was the arena made of? How was it supported? Where were the stress points? Why did the ground vibrate in that particular frequency when Vrax lifted things? The judges thought he was just making conversation. They didn't realize Marcus was essentially asking them to describe their own building's architecture. And they answered because they were proud of it. Krell engineers had designed this arena. It was a masterpiece. They were happy to explain how it worked. The second challenge was to push a series of immovable walls across the arena floor. These walls were supposedly anchored by gravity anchors and magnetic fields. Each wall was heavier than the last. Vrax pushed the first one with ease, barely straining. Marcus pretended to struggle significantly, which actually wasn't that hard, because they were designed for creatures several tons heavier than him. But while pushing, Marcus felt something crucial. The walls were locked to the floor by specific anchor points. The force distribution wasn't even. There were spots where the resistance was less intense, if you pushed at exactly the right angle, with force distributed precisely. You could actually move something designed to be immovable. The judges were getting bored with the human. He clearly wasn't a threat. He was just entertainment for the pre-trial period. They were already looking forward to Vrax's inevitable victory. and the various trade negotiations that would follow humanity's humiliating loss. Nobody was paying attention to the specific questions Marcus was asking. Nobody noticed that he was essentially mapping the arena's structural support system through trial and error. By the third challenge, which involved breaking supposedly unbreakable materials, Marcus was getting what he needed. He was mapping the arena's structure through force feedback. He understood now how the magnetic suspension systems worked. He knew where the primary support columns were located. He had basically taken a structural engineering course by asking questions and paying attention to vibrations. The unbreakable materials turned out to be composite structures with specific weak points. Marcus found those points, applied pressure in the right locations, and managed to crack one of the materials. The crowd didn't think much of it. 1 material out of 10. Vrax, meanwhile, destroyed all 10 materials without even really trying, obliterating them with casual displays of power. But Marcus kept his performance just good enough to stay in the competition. He was playing the long game. He was waiting for the final challenge. The judges were satisfied that the human was merely a temporary entertainment before the inevitable Krell victory. The betting pools had stopped updating. Everyone knew how this was going to end. Vrax would win, the Krell would gain trade agreements with Earth, and life would continue as it always had. Nobody understood that Marcus wasn't here to beat Vrax. He was here to beat the system. The final challenge was introduced with tremendous ceremony. Scritch stood in the center of the arena, his voice echoing across the stands, describing what was about to happen with obvious pleasure. He explained that both champions would attempt to lift the Monument of Eternal Victory, a structure that supposedly weighed more than a small moon. This monument had been brought to the arena at tremendous cost. No species, no individual, no matter how strong, had ever managed to lift it more than a few inches. Vrax had attempted it once. He'd managed to raise it approximately 18 inches before the strain became too great. Every other champion from previous trials had failed completely. The monument was absolute. It was permanent. It was the final test of strength. Vrax approached the monument with the confidence of someone who'd already beaten this challenge before. He positioned himself, planted his feet, and began to push. His exoskeleton rippled with effort. Muscles that shouldn't exist on an organic creature began to strain. The monument rose, Vrax's face contorted with the effort. He managed to lift it approximately 22 inches. Then he set it back down, breathing hard, satisfied with his performance. The Krell crowd roared with approval. 22 inches. That was the champion's record. Nobody else would even come close. Marcus walked up to the monument and just stared at it for a long moment. Commander Riley held her breath from the observers section. The crowd was quiet, anticipating the human's inevitable failure. Then, slowly, Marcus's face changed. The sarcastic expression faded. Something clicked behind his eyes. He'd figured it out. The monument wasn't actually that heavy. It was a trick. Not a trick exactly, but a matter of perspective. The monument was positioned on a network of precisely calculated magnetic suspension points. It was anchored by force fields in specific locations, designed to anchor it permanently. The weight wasn't the problem. The distribution was the problem. Every species that had tried had attempted to lift it conventionally, pushing straight up with raw power. But raw power wasn't the solution. Understanding was. Marcus walked around the monument slowly, analyzing it from every angle. He felt the ground beneath his feet. He could feel the subtle vibrations of the magnetic field running through the arena's support system. He could feel how the monument connected to the larger structure. Then he did something no previous champion had ever done. He asked if he was allowed to move to a different position before lifting. The judges conferred. The rules didn't actually prohibit it. They hadn't anticipated anyone would want to. Why would you? The monument was the same weight everywhere. Marcus positioned himself at what he'd calculated to be the exact gravitational center of the monument. He aligned himself with the monument's actual center of mass. Then he began to push. Not up, forward slightly, at an angle that corresponded to where the magnetic suspension fields were weakest. The monument moved, slightly at first, then more. Marcus's face went red with effort, but the monument was rising. He adjusted his angle, redistributed his force, and then something happened that nobody expected. The monument didn't just lift. The ground around it shifted. The magnetic field anchors released in sequence as Marcus reached the precise point where they were designed to disengage. And Marcus realized something monumentally important in that moment. He wasn't trying to lift just the monument. He was trying to lift everything. The arena's suspension systems were all interconnected. The entire structure was held together by the same magnetic network. If he pushed at the right points with the right force distribution, he could trigger a cascading release of the entire magnetic suspension system that held the arena itself in place. He understood this. He had been preparing for this the entire time. What happened next became the most legendary moment in the recorded history of interspecies competition. Marcus, leveraging everything he understood about physics, force distribution, and structural engineering, didn't lift the monument. He lifted the entire arena, not metaphorically, actually and physically, by positioning himself at the exact gravitational center point and pushing with force distributed across the primary support structure. Marcus triggered the entire arena's suspension system to engage in reverse. The ground beneath him shifted. The massive structure began to rise. 6 million seats, the stands, the monument, the towers, everything. Marcus was standing there in the center, arms positioned at exactly the right angle, holding what felt like the entire planet above his head. The crowd didn't know how to react. There was silence first, then confused murmuring. Then actual understanding began to set in among the educated observers. Marcus had won, not by being stronger than Vrax, but by being smarter. By understanding that the trial wasn't actually about how much weight you could lift. It was about understanding systems, about knowing how to work with a structure rather than against it, about recognizing that sometimes the solution isn't raw power, but applied intelligence. Vrax stared at the suspended arena. His mandibles drooped slightly, which probably meant he was experiencing something in the emotional spectrum that the translators couldn't capture. Scritch looked like someone had reprogrammed his exoskeleton without permission. Commander Riley's expression shifted from horrified to impressed to utterly amazed in approximately 4 seconds. The human delegation stood up and started cheering like their team had just won the championship. Because, well, their team had. The betting pools crashed. The merchandise vendors didn't know what to do. Someone had to pay out 4,000 to 1 odds to every human who had bet on this outcome. The economics were scrambling to adapt. Marcus slowly lowered the arena back down, keeping the suspension fields perfectly balanced, until everything settled back into place. He stepped away from the monument, looked directly at Vrax, and said something in Common Galactic that translated to something like, "So, same time next year, or are we good now?" The crowd erupted. Not in unified roar, but in the confused chaos of multiple species, suddenly realizing that the universe had just changed. The Krell were forced to accept humanity as equals. Trade agreements were signed. Military alliances were proposed. Humanity went from probably being food to unexpectedly dangerous in the span of 1 afternoon. Marcus was offered commendations, medals, diplomatic positions, and approximately 3 billion credits in endorsement deals. He accepted the commendations and turned down everything else. When Commander Riley asked him why, Marcus told her that he'd already gotten what he wanted, a story he could tell that nobody would believe. He went back to Earth and probably made jokes about it at his next company reunion. The gym guy definitely asked how his strength training was going. Marcus probably said something sarcastic about lifting arenas. The galaxy learned an important lesson that day. Humanity didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they looked at a problem everyone else saw as purely physical and asked, what if we thought about it differently? Because they understood that strength isn't always measured in force. Sometimes it's measured in perception. Sometimes it's about seeing the angle nobody else considered. Sometimes a human from New Jersey can